Okay, welcome and happy holidays. This is a live webinar. I will talk about what I'm going to talk about today. I will take as many questions as everyone has, and as usual, have plenty of time. So it can be about this webinar, or it can be about any other questions that you may have related to your career. This actually is a very important topic because I've noticed that a lot of attorneys either become very successful many times by using their ego, or actually end up hurting their careers because of their ego, a misunderstanding of what the ego is and how it relates to being successful and more. It's an important topic because ego is something that attorneys need. A strong ego can help you be more confident and can help you be more assertive. It can help you with opposing counsel and not get pushed around. It can be very beneficial in helping you negotiate, taking the side of people and not getting offended when people say bad things about your client, not worrying about the quality of firm you're at or the law school you went to. All these sort of things can be very helpful. It can also give you resilience, meaning it will help you rise above issues and come back. It can make you more determined, and having a sense of self-worth and confidence is extremely important. Every attorney needs to have confidence. I've come up against some of the worst attorneys in the world, and they still had confidence, and which is amazing. And they were in their 60s and 70s, and which is good. You need that confidence to be successful, but it can also lead to problems. One of the things that I've seen in ego, and I just wanted to bring this up, for whatever reason, when we poll the people that are on these calls, a lot of the people that attend these webinars, it's very interesting, are always from the top firms, meaning the top 10 firms. And I think that's because many times the people that are the best attorneys are interested in learning, which is great. Learning, getting this sort of information is very important. It can make you a better attorney. And obviously, I've been doing this for 25 years, worked with tens of thousands of attorneys, and our company makes thousands of placements now per year. So we have a very good understanding of different types of attorneys, and I certainly have a lot of advice that can help you. One of the things I did want to say is many times when an attorney goes to a top law school or does well there, or sometimes they may gets a job at a top firm, it can often create what I think is a sense of entitlement. They may feel that their law school automatically entitles them to certain privileges and opportunities. Then because of that, they're less likely to work hard. They may turn off candidate or other attorneys in the firm that may not have those things and pretty much get blown out of the water, and very bad experiences despite being very smart. I see that all the time. And it tends to happen to people a lot of times that went to the very top law schools, which would be like Yale and things like that. And then sometimes kind of the lower end schools of the top 10, which would be like your Michigans and Virginias and stuff, that happens to them as well. A top law school and top law firm can also create a lot of overconfidence. You may feel that you've already are automatically qualified for certain positions. And if you're not treated well, even by a top 10 firm or top 100 firm, that will put you in a position where you can leave and do other things. Many times they may make mistakes and not be thorough and more concerned about being treated a certain way because of their background. That's an ego issue. So I wanted to bring that up as well. And then sometimes people are more focused on their prestige than anything else. So I wanted to bring that up, being very concerned if you have very good qualifications. Your ego can also many times hurt you to some extent. I did want to talk a lot about ego today. Being an attorney really doesn't need ego, but there's a difference between a kind of a healthy ego and a non-healthy ego. To some extent, it can actually lead to mental disorders and other things. It's often a cause of unhappiness. There's a lot of writing out there by lawyers that have written about ego and things. But if you're a law student, you're right now going through mental changes that law school gives people. Certain law schools do it more than others. Where I went to law school, Virginia, like it was always portrayed as a law school that didn't push that type of change so much, whereas other law schools did. And before law school, most attorneys, and I actually believe this, are actually healthier psychologically and physically than the general population before they start law school. They often start with a very good sense of self-worth. And then he says that in his research, he's found that the formal structure of law school starts to change that rather than come back to their self, students begin to focus on external values like their status, comparative worth, and competition. Certain people come from very good families and have very good parents where their parents build them up. They talk to them about problems and they give them suggestions where they have good role models. They watch their parents do certain things and overcome certain issues. Their parents are very encouraging. They have a good support network of parents and friends and others that they may have developed, and other people don't. I'm not judging it. I'm not saying one is different than the other. But when you don't have that, a lot of times that your ego, instead of coming from parents and others that may have built you up from the time that happens to a lot of people, unfortunately. Many times with substance abuse problems, relationship problems, and all these problems, you can many times go back and see that in the family dynamic, for whatever reason, they weren't getting what they needed. And it's very sad. So then those people, for their values, instead of reverting to their history and having something to draw back on and models, they have to get it externally. Sometimes people join gangs if they're in a bad neighborhood and they deal drugs, or other people become very good students and then they start doing that. But law students in particular become very focused on things like status and their comparative worth to other people and their competition with other people. And he says that we have seven very strong studies that show that this can twist people's psyches, and they come out of law school significantly impaired with depression, anxiety, and hostility. I had a very interesting thing. I've told this story before, but I was in law school and I was in this outline group, and I was in the library. And there was a friend of mine, not really a friend of mine, more like an acquaintance, but he was in an outline group with me, and he had this incredible outline, and it was just for our property class, and it had transcribed things that the professor had said the previous year, which matched the same thing he taught, and it was just the most amazing freaking outline I'd ever seen, and then had summaries, and then it was great. And I was like, where the heck did you get this? And he said, I got it from someone who's also in our outline group. And I said, who else has it? And he told me, I don't know, then there were 12 people or whatever for weeks we have to do. And he said, pretty much everyone. He named 7 or 8 people. And I said, can I have a copy? He said, no, because I promised each of those people that I wouldn't never show it to anyone. And I'm not even supposed to be looking at it in the library. And I was like, wow. And I said, can I copy it? And he said, sure, but I don't want you copying it in town. I want you to, and I was in Charlottesville. I want you to drive out of town 30 minutes to copy it. And I was like, to this other town, I forget what it was called. And I said, okay, sure, no problem. So this is back in the days when people had to run things through copiers and everything. So I did that, and then I brought it back. And then I was in this outline group, and there was this thing at Virginia was very interesting where if you lied, you got kicked out of school. If someone caught you lying, you would be brought up by this honor code and all these things. And so I went up and I asked each of these 7 or 8 people that he told me had copies of this outline if they had it, because you'd all stand out in front of these classrooms, like these big groups of people before these classes, and then the classroom would open, you'd go in. And each one of them said no, but something along, if you see one, if you have it, if you see another outline, let me know. I'd love to see it. These were people that were in my outline group and that I would even study with. I was amazed that all these people said no, they didn't have one. And then I went, and I remember then one day, a week later or something, I was sitting behind one of these people who said no, and I saw them looking at this outline and following the class. So amazing that this is how a lot of times people will act. And because of this competition, these people were lying, and it really, if it says that law school can create depression, anxiety, and hostility, it certainly, that was a very upset thing, because these are people that I thought were my friends, or at least people that I knew well. And so academics often study law students because they're considered sort of bellwether of the profession, and a lot of times I encourage students to take emotion out of their decisions. You start reinforcing the lack of emotion in decisions with grades and money, and you're not just suppressing your emotions, you're changing who you are. So think about this. All of these people were lying to me in this example I'm giving you, just lying right to my face, and they were risking, I guess, getting kicked out of school. I don't think they would have really been kicked out of school, but the school did kick people out for lying. I had an instance, this is just in my sophomore year or second year of law school, I guess it would be sophomore year, but school and it had maybe 300 students. There was a legal research class that all these third years were supposed to take, and 10 people were kicked out for plagiarizing footnotes. It's just right before graduation. So they took it seriously. But you're changing who you are. And a lot of times when you study lawyers' happiness, there's just a lot of psychological factors that kind of erode during law school. And these are factors that are very important for the well-being of lawyers. This is a quote from a professor, and that the wrote in what makes lawyers happy. And then the factors emphasized in law school, which are grades, honors, and career income, don't really have any bearing on ultimate lawyer well-being and happiness. It just doesn't compute. It's not, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But after lawyers begin law school, they often experience a lot of depression, negative mood and physical symptoms, and corresponding decreasing in effect and life satisfaction. I had an instance where I think I may have told this story last week, where I don't know, I was talking about taking vitamin D or something to someone because it can give you energy when the sun goes down and when there start being less sun, and because your body, it's a good thing. So I was talking to a friend of mine while studying for exams, and I said, what's really good and he'd gone to Harvard for college and then for graduate school, and then I was at Virginia for law school, and I said, what's really good for energy? And he said, what, Prozac? And I said, no. And he said, what? Why do you say that? And he said, well, all my friends or everyone I know at Harvard is taking. And Prozac back then was, I guess, I don't know if it still is, but a very popular antidepressant. And a lot of people rely on outside things when they become law students that they may not have had before. And there's also the shedding of idealism. So a lot of times people, when they say they want to go to law school, they talk about being interested in public interest and all sorts of things. And then within the first year, their motivation is often shifted. So these are people that did really good things for the community and were interested in the community. Then all of a sudden are become more interested in making money and extrinsic types of things that they may not have been interested in. And this can make you very unhappy. The highest salary does not make you happy. The most prestigious firm does not make you happy. Going to the best law firm does not make you happy. These are not things that make you happy. You may believe they do because this is what everyone's talking about, but they don't make you happy. And law firms and the law school can really hurt you. So rather than a healthy sense of self, a lot of people will base how they feel about themselves based on how they compare to others. And I'm sure that you, as an attorney or law student, have seen this and probably do it yourself. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this. Everyone does. But it really does create an endless cycle of unhappiness, and it can haunt you and stay with you throughout your career. People do this forever. I talk to attorneys these days and people that I know, and I call them and they tell me where they're living, what they're driving, what club who cares? Or what restaurant they got into, or where their kids are going to school. Or I got a call on, Monday afternoon. I was driving back from skiing, and someone called me and said that I hadn't spoken to in 20 years. And the first thing out of their mouth was, my nephew just graduated or from this Cornell or something. And I was like, really? This is what I hear after? And so people become very focused on this stuff. And this sort of ego in this direction will really affect you in a negative way and determine the type of person you become. If you are concerned about the quality of firm you're at and define yourself on that, if you are concerned with how much money you're making and always define yourself on that, if you are concerned with what other people are saying about you all the time and to base your life on that, if you are concerned with all these things, you're going to have problems. What are you going to do? Because you can never control it. So this is what creates substance abuse problems. This is what creates depression. This is what creates stress. This is what it can create cancer and early death. And it can create divorce when it can create a multitude of problems that could really be avoided if you didn't put the stuff in control. And this is so prevalent that many times the better the attorney, often the more the ego is in control. Again, like I talk to attorneys at all levels, but I talk to attorneys that do incredibly well and ones, but the largest egos are all over. They're really all over, and it can hurt you. And this is your self-consciousness, your sense of self, and how you view yourself compared to others. And I keep coming back to how you were raised and the input you got and the the sense of self you have and where that comes from. Because if you don't have a strong sense of self and you're getting this stuff from outside things, which is okay, but you should have some sort of support, whether it's a family that you build yourself or your ex that helps you. Because all people are ego-based and compare themselves to others. They compare how they look, how they feel, where they work, who their spouse is, all these things, which is unfortunate. And a healthy ego allows you to have perspective and to not allow these feelings to overwhelm and consume you in your actions. And you really do need to have a healthy psychology and insight to realize that none of this compares your self-worth and what is necessary for you to be happy. And again, the reason I'm talking with so much passion about this is a big deal for attorneys. And it's probably a big deal. It's a big deal for most people because I want you to be happy and I want you to live a good life and I want you to really do the best you can. And because if you do have an unhealthy psychology and you base your comparisons and believe that happiness is related to this, it's going to be unhealthy. And this impacts all sorts of people. I can't believe how many people it impacts. I've had instances where I've been called on the phone by very well-known people, like famous attorneys and deans of law schools and well-known people in the legal profession saying, and this is one I'm thinking of not too long ago, I would like to have lunch with you or something. And I'm like, wow, what an honor. Okay, I'll have lunch with the head of this AmLaw 5 firm or whatever. And the person's, yes, I'm in San Francisco on business, but I'd like to come down to LA and meet with you. And I'm like, great, no problem. And then the person gets here and I'm having lunch with a well-known person that's, for all intents and purposes, it could be a lot of people's hero. And all of a sudden, this is a recent one, the person pulls out a computer and I've said, I've had a nice lunch with you, but I was just curious why we're here. And the person will say, I'll tell you why I'm here. And I look at this computer and the computer's got like some sort of mask on it. So you can't see it looking sideways. There's cameras. You can only see it if you look directly at it. And the computer says, I'm here because an article appeared on one of your sites and it said something mean about me or whatever it was. And I would like you to take it down. And I'm like, wow, like this is a famous person that's well known. And someone on my staff or something has written an article or something that put this person in a bad light. And this is how upset they are. Other times, if you really want to upset someone, there may be a negative review about a firm or someone. And it's the same thing happens. So people are extremely concerned about how others view them. Even the most successful people, they don't. And now let's talk about some very famous people. If you get to the level of someone like even Musk, who just decided to resign from Twitter because he did a poll and people said they didn't like him or they didn't want him to be CEO anymore. Now, I don't know if that's a healthy psychology or not when you spend billions of dollars on a website and decide that you don't, and you resign because of it. People they have very weak egos. And I don't know that he has a weak ego because he's done incredibly well, but the unhealthy psychology can create problems. So do you have a healthy or unhealthy ego? How do you know? A lot of people that are very successful practicing law have often allowed their egos to dominate them. And because of that, they're often very unhappy with their lives. They're constantly pushing themselves in their jobs. They never feel good enough. There's some sort of void that can't be filled because of their egos control the conversations they have with themselves every day. They're very concerned about their egos and how they look to others. And these egos dominate them. They allow them to feel good or bad about themselves, successful or unsuccessful, fulfilled or unfulfilled, based on their analysis of where they sit in the pecking order. And this ego creates your identity through your evaluation of yourself compared to others. And it's very common. Let me just give you 1 second here. This happens. And to the extent you base your self-worth and how you feel about yourself and comparing to others in your peers, you're going to be more ego-based. And to the extent you do not base your feelings about yourself on your comparison to your peers, you're going to be less ego-based. This ego is such an interesting thing. So it's so interesting because it's so many people want to put themselves in a certain pecking order and they want to really look like a certain type of person to others and it's very interesting and that how people do this and to not basing yourself on these sorts of comparisons is very important. People are social animals and they tend to rise or fall based on their ego's analysis of themselves based on who they compare themselves to. And And one of the problems, of course, of going to good schools many times and so forth is that you're often going to judge yourself much harder, and especially and also working in major legal markets like New York or in LA and Chicago and at least Houston and all these big legal markets, is that you're going to be around people and compare yourself to them. And that's how it works. Now, there are benefits to that. You can often do very well based on that you will rise to the level often of the people that you're with. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. It's actually very common. I had an interesting thing happen. I was invited to this dinner years ago of, this guy that he'd started this real estate training company and made all this money and then sold it. And it was a big company, hundreds of employees, and he'd sold it. And then he decided to spend 3 or 4 years going to talk to the Dalai Lama and the most successful figures all over. And the only conclusion that he reached was that people become this, and he was looking for enlightenment and to meet God and everything, but people become the people that you surround yourself with are what create you. And if you want to be very happy, you surround yourself with happy people. If you want to be very close to God, you surround yourself with other people if you want. So the groups you are with are very important. I'm not going to deny that. And I will just say for you personally and everyone on this call personally, if you spend your time with people that are very unhappy, you're going to be unhappy. If you spend your time with people that are very competitive, you're going to be uncompetitive. If you spend your time with people that are very happy, you will do well. And it always happens. You could, for example, be best friends with someone and that person could be very happy. And then that person could get involved in another social group of other people that aren't happy. And all of a sudden that person is unhappy. And and then maybe it's not good for you to be with them. But you will compare yourself, that the people you're around will determine your success. If you are in a law firm with people that are not successful, that's probably what you will become. I'm not saying that to be mean to you. I'm just saying that's what will happen. I had an experience my first summer where I worked in the Justice Department and in Washington, D.C., and no one showed up before 10 and everyone was getting out of there around 4:30. And even though it was some of the smartest people you could imagine, I think they all went to Yale, Stanford, and all those kind of schools. And it was a fairly small group. The people almost seemed like zombies. They weren't happy. They didn't have a lot of energy. And I would walk out of there. And then I think I was near Paul Hastings and a couple other really good firms. And I would see those attorneys and I would be like, these are the people I want to be like, and not these people that I was with. And I'm not saying everyone in the Justice Department's like that because it's just not true. But this particular group that I was with, it was like that. The people you're around do impact your happiness. And the most competitive and smartest people have certain ways of thinking, acting, and setting goals. They're going to run off of you and raise your standards. This, by the way, is the reason you want to go to a good law school. It's not because you're going to learn anything differently. It's because you're going to be around, if you go to a good law school or a good firm, you're going to be around people that have higher standards for themselves and are probably going to become more successful as well. You're not going to learn anything differently. But the quality of people, meaning their motivation, their goals, their intelligence sometimes, and I'm not saying that in a negative way, are probably going to be higher. And one of the things I'll say right now with all these law schools not reporting themselves to U.S. News and things, essentially what they're doing is they're saying, it's very interesting because there's this kind of change in society going on where we're moving more towards socialism. And I'm not judging that one way or another, but the reason the law schools don't want to have to report their numbers is because they're saying that we don't want these types of standards. We want to admit people that are very concerned with social justice and not money. And we want to do this. And those types of people may not have the best grades. And we want to admit that we're having a hard time getting the type of diversity of whatever that we want with the way things are working. We want to be able to not have to be accountable for these standards. And we want to have a different type of group of people. Now, is that good for the legal profession? That's what they think it is. And there's certain schools that don't believe that, which are Chicago and Virginia, some other ones that haven't. But it's interesting. Families, of course, want to live in the best neighborhoods because of things not just like safety, but because their children are likely to socialize and be around people who have higher expectations for themselves. That's just how it works. This is why people go to private schools and live in good neighborhoods. It's amazing that works. It's just the way it is. I had an experience where I grew up in a city called Grosse Pointe with some people that I went to elementary school, and this is in Michigan, and there were people that much smarter than I was in different classes. I mean, at least they were doing better in school. Anyway, when I was in these Grosse Pointe public schools, and then I ended up going to a kind of a boarding school, and in my boarding school, a bunch of people went to Yale and places like that. But it was interesting that in Grosse Pointe, one guy I know went to Yale on a football scholarship and said he was the first person in 25 years from Grosse Pointe South to go to Yale, which is a good school at Grosse Pointe South. And I was just amazed. So I think the environment you're in can sometimes have a huge impact on what happens to people. And that's why people try to go to better colleges. Those sorts of people are often less likely to go to prison, and they're more likely to become more successful. It's not because those schools are teaching anything different. It's because of the people that they're around and the standards those people have. And it's also the same thing with social groups. So you want to be in the best social groups many times you can. People spend a lot of money joining different social groups and being very competitive on that, because those social groups have certain values and certain advantages and influence how this influences us. I had an experience where I was talking to this Tony Robbins, who's a motivational guru. And early in his career, he caught someone's attention that was president of a major network or something in LA. And Tony was young at the time. And they said, we'd like you to join the social group of ours. It's, $150,000 a year, but there's all these very famous, or not famous, but very successful and well-known people in it. And it's maybe 20 people. But it's $150,000 a year. And Tony was like, I don't know if I have the money to be part of this. And he said, you can't afford not to be part of it, because you're going to absorb these people's way of thinking and everything. And it was $150,000 a year because they chartered jets and took all these trips, and who knows what the hell the heck. But anyway, and this is probably 30 years ago, 25 years ago, I don't know. And he joined it and said it changed his life and his career. So people do this because these sort of groups and firms and things, they can also rub off on you, and they're very important. And children do that. So children try to be part of the popular and unpopular groups. If you're impressionable, you will join groups that are more concerned with popularity than scholastic things. And who knows? And if you feel excluded from certain types of groups where it's about looks or sports or whatever, and instead you become academic, you may feel inferior, and that's a part of it. And it's the same thing with legal employers. And this is very important. It's very difficult to gain entry into these law firms. They're very exclusionary. They're mysteriously exclusionary. I have firms that never hire laterally. Some of them are Cravath and Wachtel and some other places. They may in the future, but they're very nice to me. But they never are going to hire people from us, and because they don't hire laterally, they just don't. And there's certain ones that, even though they do hire laterally, are very difficult to get into. And people want to be part of these groups, and they want to do them for a lot of reasons. I will call up, sometimes I have openings where a law firm's saying, we're looking for a 10th year trust and estates attorney. It could be a big firm. It could be Simpson Thacher. Who knows? Some of these firms and we're looking for a 10th year to take over someone's. And you could call someone that's very well established at a smaller firm, and they will almost always say yes to talking to. Now, I'm not saying Simpson Thacher is not a firm that I've ever done this with, because I don't, but I'm just using them as an example. But certainly, I think they do have a trust and estates practice. But the point is that the candidates will immediately jump on the opportunity to get into these firms. Just how lawyers are. And the best firms, typically, there's reasons people want to be in, and they have the best work, and then they do the work for the largest and most prestigious companies. And if you do try to move into these better groups, the ways of thinking and the goals you set around those people will rub off on you. I started my career at a firm where, attorney a couple doors down from me became head of the FCC. I was appointed by Obama because I went to law school with him and other things. And so those ways of thinking and things, and there were other people that became very well known and famous, rub off on you. And it's a big deal. The people you surround yourself at work, I want to talk a little bit about this because it's very important. And what type of thoughts do you surround yourself with? What type of things are you reading? How are you thinking about things? Because most attorneys, especially the most successful ones, are really caught in a very ego-centered profession where you're constantly comparing yourself with others. And that's tough. And it's set up this way. So you're being sliced and diced into different boxes, which determine your status. You're either an associate or a partner or counsel or staff attorney or contract attorney. And it's so pronounced that it can be consuming for many attorneys. They can't deal with it. It starts where you go to law school. It's crazy. Who cares where you went to law school? I'm sorry. I'm in the legal placement business, but I've come to the point of view that I think it's good to go to a good law school. I'm not denying that. I think everyone should do the best they can. But I don't like how people base their futures and if they're going to become successful based on these things, because it's just not true. Your success is based on a lot of other things, but the slicing and dicing starts where you go to law school. And the higher ranked schools give you more prestige earlier in your career and can give you a higher sense of self. And then your grades in law school matter, and they determine where you get your first summer job and where your first job is. And if you don't do well in law school for whatever reason, that can hurt you. And then if you don't get a summer job, that can hurt you. If your first position is not what you want it to be, that can hurt you. Now, that can hurt you in your own mind, but it doesn't necessarily hurt you. And I want to just be clear with you that if you didn't get a summer job, or you didn't get into a good law school, or you didn't get into the best firm or whatever, these are just temporary setbacks. And you should use these as rocket fuel to empower you to do better in the future and to try harder and to find more opportunities. You shouldn't be using these as reasons to feel badly about yourself. It can also determine by the size of the city you're in, by the quality of your firm, by all these things. And so people really base themselves on that. People base themselves how successful they are, whether or not they got a job in a big city or they're the big firm in the big city and all these things. And then they talk about that. And that becomes important. And then, so attorneys, then they start, once you get through all this, then you start comparing yourselves to attorneys in your own firm and how you're doing compared to them and what the firm says about you and the amount of work you got and the hours and whether or not you're working with the most important partners. And then you start comparing yourselves based on your hours and then that they bill and all this stuff. And it could be consuming. And then if you become partners are even more guilty of this. I think being a partner actually is much harder than an associate or any other type of role, because what happens is then you start comparing to others based on the amount of business you bring in and then the number of hours you bill and how you're being compensated. Some of the attorneys with the lowest self-esteem that I encounter many times are partners without business or partners. It's very sad. And it's just how it works. And then many attorneys are always seeking to get into the best firms they can, and there's nothing wrong with that. And they want to work with the best people. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think a lot of it's related to ego. Attorneys want to be in a position where they evaluate themselves more highly in comparison to their peers. That's just how it works. And a lot of attorneys want to work for the best law firms they can because this gives them more status compared to their peers. They're always comparing themselves to others and feeling good about yourselves based on your accomplishments in comparison to your peers is a trap that a lot of attorneys fall into and spending their careers absorbed in. I had a very funny experience. Years ago, this is, 20 years ago, a long time ago, I was living in Pasadena, California, and I bought a little beach house in Malibu. And I invited some attorneys over and that I knew. And one of them said, "This is a great house. It's very impressive. It's something along the lines of when you get to a point where this is no longer impressing people, you can get a bigger one or something." And I was like, wow, where does that come from? And this is just how they were thinking about things and how they would think about, this is very impressive. When you get to the point where this is no longer impressing people, you can get a bigger one or something. And I was like, wow, why would someone say something like that? So an attorney oftentimes realizes they can't compete in a game where they won't make partner if they're not committed enough, or they will never generate enough business if they don't believe in themselves. And they'll often save their ego by pretending they never wanted to work in a law firm anyway and start trying to go in-house. So they'll basically give up. They'll protect their ego, saying that they're just doing this for a few years. They're doing something else. They don't want to do it, when in reality, they probably were trying to get something, but then they decided that where they get psyched out and do something else. And a lot of this, I think, is related to ego. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with going in-house. It's an amazing career choice for a lot of people. I'm not criticizing that, but I'm telling you that to protect your ego, a lot of people take these routes. And a lot of times they go into the largest markets they can work at, away from their families and support networks, to do the same thing to protect your ego. This is a little bit about prestige, and I'm just going to talk about this briefly, but the right market for people often connotes prestige. Attorneys in the largest markets often believe that those in smaller markets are not as competent as they are. And I know this because I've worked in large markets and small markets. I had my first experience was clerking in a federal court outside of Detroit. And when attorneys would come into that courtroom, local attorneys would be just amazed. Like you'd be in a room with, I don't know, we had class actions. You'd be in a room with like 50 attorneys on this class action. They'd have a big conference room, and one of the attorneys would be like, this is our colleague from, I don't know, Sherman and Sterling. And it would be like some first year associate. And everyone, these 100 attorneys would all be like, wow, just very funny. Whereas no one would care in a lot of big markets. But this was I remember that. And then I don't even know if it was Sherman and Sterling. I think it was, anyway, it doesn't matter. But it's funny. And then the attorneys in the largest markets will, of course, always talk down to believe that they're more competent than attorneys in smaller markets. And then there is, by the way, if you are an attorney in a big New York law firm, there's a certain pace and ways of thinking about problems and cutting through stuff that may not exist in other markets to some extent, because it's just people don't always think that way. I'm not criticizing the legal markets, but I am telling you that the largest markets and the firms can create a certain type of attorney that does provide often better results to the clients. I don't know why that is. I think it's the environment. I don't know. And there's a perception that attorneys a lot of times in the smaller markets are not as competent. And again, I'm not criticizing smaller markets. I think attorneys in smaller markets are actually happier. So I don't think that, but I'm just telling you how the ego works and the perceptions. The work does tend to go to attorneys in the largest markets, the most important work. The quality of work is often considered much more thorough in the largest markets, meaning law firms that are doing the most important corporate work there is are often in New York. There's certainly incredible firms in Silicon Valley and stuff, but often the firms in New York often are a little bit different than other firms. There's just ways of doing the work and expectations that are historical in nature. I'm not criticizing any Silicon Valley firms in other markets. I'm just telling you what the perception is in the market. And even if you run a huge company or have a huge legal matter and you start talking to people, who should I use and stuff, there's just big firms that have come up with the most deep-pocketed clients in big markets. And those often are in New York, in LA, and there's a lot of great firms here. But there's so many people competing to work there in those markets that everyone's quickly replaceable. So if you're a corporate firm in Boise, Idaho, and there's some great firms there, by the way, big firms, and you have an opening for a 10th year securities attorney, you're going to have a little bit of a wait. And I'm just saying to find people, and Boise is a great market. But if you're in New York and you have an opening for a 10th year securities attorney, you can get hundreds of applicants, or pretty much not hundreds, but a lot from not just New York, but all over the country very quickly. Most attorneys in the market like New York are very replaceable. They know that they have to provide a lot of value very quickly. They know that the firm is evaluating them based on people that they've had working there in the past, and there's pressure to perform. That's just not there in a lot of other markets. And I know this from a recruiting standpoint. The second a firm in New York City has an opening, it's crazy. If you're watching this in New York, and again, people in New York and big firms tend to watch this a lot, these presentations, because I think they're trying to learn this stuff, and everybody that's learning this stuff is very smart doing so. I just want to put that out there. This is incredibly very important information. But in New York, the second a law firm has an opening, they know that they're going to get tons of openings or candidates. So if you're at a firm in New York City and you decide you want to talk back to a partner, and the partner says, I'm just going to replace this person, all they need to do is put the word out to all these little boutique recruiting firms, which they'll do very quickly, and they'll have 50 people knocking on their door, some much more qualified than you, many hungrier than you, ready to replace you. That's scary. So you have to produce at a certain rate. And candidates know that. And that's not nice. Most major firms in these markets will have a lot of people to replace them. And so you either perform at a level you're expected to and provide a lot of value, or you're quickly pushed out. And this concentration of people in these major markets is similar. So is Chicago, and so is the Bay Area. That is something that creates higher quality work and more demands. It's just how it works. People are not as terrified of losing their jobs in Omaha. It's just not how it works. It's not the way it is. And the performance levels are not expected to be as high. And that creates a certain type of attorneys. If you aren't doing a good job, you're quickly given a lot of clues that you should start looking elsewhere. You may not be given work, and you'd be told you don't have any work. You may be given dumb assignments. I was in a firm once where there was a very qualified litigator. This is in a New York firm, and he upset someone. I don't know what he did. And all of a sudden, they took away all his work and started giving him these dumb collection cases to work on, suing the firm's clients that hadn't paid. This is just how it works. You'll be given poor reviews, even if the stuff isn't true. Many times meaning reviews that are just not nice. There's just no reason for them. They may say things like, many people don't believe in you, or you're not giving us a lot of confidence in your future. Just kind of these blank statements, and then criticisms about your work that are just vague. And so the point is, that's just what they do. Or you'll be given death stares, meaning people will look at you in a funny way, or and all these sorts of things happen. And this is just the way it works. And I'm not criticizing New York. I'm telling you that it produces high quality work. It makes people paranoid about making mistakes and losing their jobs. It makes people work harder, and it makes people, and then you're going to, by default, be surrounded by other people that are also paranoid like that and are judging you under the same standards they feel judged at, whether you're a junior associate talking to a senior associate or whatever. And it's going to breed a certain type of attorney. And it's going to make it's even more tough. And I'm just telling you how hard this is, because you're going to be many times in firms where it's going to be impossible for you to ever make partner. But that's okay, because you're learning these skills and you're getting access to the most important work and some other advantages that are very important. So that's good. And again, outside of New York, the same psychology exists. You have lots of big cities all around the country where attorneys have a sense of importance. So they will think they're a bigger deal if they're in a bigger market than a smaller market, and all sorts of things. And the attorney in Chicago often feels superior to the attorney in Detroit, but the attorney in Houston may feel superior to the one in San Antonio, and so forth. It's just how it works. The one in Miami feels superior to the one in Tallahassee. And again, is an attorney in the larger market happier? No, but the ego is often driving a decision about what market to work in. And again, I'm not going so far as to postulate that every attorney in New York is there because of their ego. But in my experience, you have to have a good ego in order to stay working there. And a lot of times people believe egos are so strong that they believe that they'll keep working there because they don't want to look like a failure for leaving. And then the other funny thing that happens, this is very interesting, is and I'm sure if you're in a New York firm, then you notice this, when a lot of people leave these big firms in New York, if they don't go in-house and they leave, and if they move to another market, rather than taking another job and looking like a failure to their people that they may know from law school or that firm, they often will do nothing. Or it's very interesting, or just some other career entirely, when they are very talented and should be practicing law. It's the dumbest thing they can do. Everything that they've learned would make them great attorneys, and big fish in smaller ponds and all these things. But they don't do it because they know how other people at their firm think about them. And it's not bad to work in a major market. What's bad, though, is if you do it for your ego and you allow it to hold you back. And then you need to have a corresponding benefit in terms of happiness. And a lot of people will suffer being in that position and worry about not being as good as their peers. And attorneys in markets like New York will often, again, I'm not criticizing New York, I'm actually saying great things about it and the firms there, but they'll often live in smaller apartments, work harder, be taxed a lot, and end up clearing less money than they would in smaller markets, but they're being exposed to that pressure in those types of large clients. And again, there's so many different levels of prestige that a lot of people feel like they're never successful enough. And so one of the things, I talk about this a lot, and I talk about this because I've seen how important this is and really how it helps people and what happens. But I've noticed that when attorneys start their careers in smaller markets or wind up there after practicing in large markets, they're often much more likely to be practicing law, continue practicing law in law firms throughout their careers than attorneys that go to the largest markets. Now, I want to make sure I repeat that because I want you to understand this. If you're a law student, if you're a practicing attorney, you can practice law, by the way, into your 80s and be very happy doing it. Worked with lots of attorneys that have. I worked with attorneys that were in their 80s and had books of business of, I'm just thinking of one recent example, $7 or $8 million and moving firms. Who would have thought? But that's what happens. Look at our president right now is 80 plus. You can practice law a long time. So deciding to leave law because of a couple bad years at a big firm is insane. It's ridiculous. Like, why would you? I don't get it. But this is what people do. And you can have a very happy career. I just want to make this clear too to people that are on this webinar, because this could be some of the most important advice that you ever receive. Your first few years of practicing law are an apprenticeship. It's no different than working as a resident in a hospital for 2 years and working 36 hours straight or 48 hours straight for years with one day off in between a 48-hour. It's grueling. It's not the kind of thing you want to do the rest of your life. But this is an apprenticeship. If you get into a big law firm and work there for 5 years, that's an apprenticeship. It's going to create a certain type of product. But it'll do that because of, obviously, that's how they make money, but also because they know that it reinforces habits and ways of thinking and makes you better and able to think on your feet even when you're tired and all these different sorts of things. And so do law firms. It's how law firms make all their money. But this apprenticeship in the largest law firms, which was started by Cravath in the 1960s or late 50s, when U.S. companies started getting larger, is something that breeds good attorneys. And so you do not quit the practice of law because you're in your apprenticeship and think it's hard. That is not what the whole career has to be. That's insane. Wow. But that's what people do. But anyway, you should, and I'm just encouraging you that you are in an apprenticeship. If you think it's bad and demanding, you're just in an apprenticeship. Of course it is. That's how it works. Anybody that wants to be successful in anything has to do an apprenticeship. The longer the apprenticeship, the more successful you're going to be. And then you can take those skills somewhere else. Imagine watching the most successful attorneys in the United States, the ones that are the most highly paid and that have the biggest clients. Imagine getting the opportunity to watch that firsthand for 5 years and work for those people. And then you quit because you think it's hard. That's not how it works. You're in an apprenticeship. So I just want to make sure you understand that. And these people have something to teach you because they've risen through that when other people haven't. And you have a very good experience and opportunity. And you can either take it seriously or not. But if you take it seriously, those people will help you. I have a cousin that I think he worked at Sherman and Sterling and did an exceptional, worked very hard for one partner there. And then the firm was downsizing, so they let him go. And he worked for this guy for a couple of years, very hard, or 3 or 4 years, and maybe worked for a couple other partners. And when they let him go, they figured out that he was having a difficult time finding a job. So they found him a job working for one of their clients, and he's worked there for, decades and makes millions of dollars a year as a general counsel and has a very good life. Wow. So this is what you get in people, how they can help you if you do this. And so I'm just encouraging everyone to realize the difference between an apprenticeship and a job. Your first 5 years are not a job. It's not a job. It's not a job. It's an apprenticeship. Never think of it as a job. Even up to 7 or 8 years, it's not a job. It's an apprenticeship where you're getting skills. So a lot of times what I've noticed is attorneys who start their careers in large markets, because of their ego and all these other things, they worry about how they're getting paid, their bonuses, all this other things. They often don't stay. They decide that this apprenticeship is too hard and they leave and they quit, or their ego says, they're just thinking in the wrong way. They're thinking, oh, it's about my ego. It's about how I compare. They're not thinking of this apprenticeship. And so instead, they end up not practicing law and they give up this career that they could be doing for another 60 years because they're a little upset with a hard law firm that they start their career with, or one that's too demanding, and an apprenticeship. That's like a doctor walking out of a residency when they're 2 steps away. I have another relative that's an orthopedic surgeon, went to good schools and came out of her residency and makes $700,000 or $800,000 a year in a hospital working 9 to 5. Who would have thought? All this stuff, like you do an apprenticeship, you're going to do well. So the point is that you have to really understand that, that this is an apprenticeship. And so a lot of attorneys in large markets will quit. Whereas the attorneys in the smaller markets, I don't think are so caught up in all this ego stuff. And they end up staying with the practice of law. And they end up having long-term careers when they might not otherwise have those careers. So they stick with it and they don't leave, because the attorneys in the largest markets during this apprenticeship are often feel like they never want to work in a law firm again, and they often don't develop books of business where they might have in smaller markets, and they often go in-house because they think that's the only option, or because they believe they have no future in larger law firms. Attorneys in the largest markets are often much less likely to become partners than the ones in smaller markets if they stay there in a large firm. And again, I believe that if you're so wrapped up in your ego that you think you need to be a big deal and so forth, just realize you're in an apprenticeship. But if you go to work in a smaller market, you're often not going to be that doesn't exist to that extent. And it's just because the people you're surrounded with, the people with the largest egos and need to feed their egos will go to those big markets and be impacted by it. Whereas if you go to a smaller market, you're often more likely to have long-term success and happiness in a law firm than a larger one. But if you can deal with the fact that you're not at the biggest, most prestigious firm, which is fine. And again, the attorneys who work in the largest markets are often not practicing law in 10 years, where if they went to a smaller market, they could spend their entire career counseling people, be considered experts, being respected in the community, having people call them for business, being asked to talk, being told they're thought of as an attorney and saying this person's an attorney. Where I grew up, I knew all the kids whose parents were attorneys, and I was in awe. Again, I grew up in a suburb of Detroit. But again, if you work in a smaller market, it's just different. An attorney in a smaller market is like the big fish. The kids of the attorney are big fish. It's all relative, but it's a big deal being an attorney in smaller markets. I know they think your ego will be fed and you will feel happy and like you're contributing and like you're giving something. So if your ego drives your choice of the market to be in, you're going to be less happy many times and maybe ultimately less successful than if you're in a smaller market. If you are numbing yourself with medication, with alcohol, with unmeaningful relationships and other problems and depression and who knows, maybe that's just because your ego is not giving you a sense of your self-worth, and maybe you're basing it on some things that are based on how you feel about yourself inside. And again, you're not going to go back and turn the clock back on yourself and get new parents and you have to do with what you have. But I am telling you that a lot of the stuff you're not going to get from a law firm. You're going to have to get it. It's going to have to come from you internally. But I will tell you again that attorneys in smaller markets often do not have the same problems that a lot of times attorneys in large markets have. Now, there's nothing wrong with being an attorney in a large market. Many people come into that with the ego and the background and the parents and the just natural fortitude to do it. But there's definitely a belief that you have to work in larger firms and larger markets. And again, larger firms pay the most, the training's better, the work is often very good, and most important, they're often more connected politically, socially, and the markets are in. It's also easier to lateral to other prestigious firms from the largest firms and go in-house to large employers a lot of times from major firms because of the pressure, the ability that they have to recruit people. You're working with people that are often more on their toes. And oftentimes, again, most attorneys throughout their careers remain interested in working for these firms. Not all of them do, but a lot of them do, and throughout their entire careers. I don't think it's that important, to be honest with you. I think you should really be focused on enjoying what you're doing, practicing law. And you may enjoy in a large firm. There are people that are completely cut out for it. And again, I'm not criticizing these large firms. I think there are people that are perfect fits for it. But if you're constantly comparing yourself to others and being governed by your ego, that's not good. There's a constant feeling you need to be with a different firm that you may have. It's not healthy. And it's not going to benefit you in the long run. And again, these large firms are dangerous. They can replace you very quickly. They have high expectations because they can pay for them and their clients are willing to pay for them. Those high expectations, they're often less collegial, not always, but often less collegial. The attorneys are often more competitive with one another. They're more corporate in nature, impersonal, and it can create an unpleasant atmosphere if the attorneys work there and make people unhappy. It's interesting when you go into these smaller markets and these smaller firms, I mean, the people have been there since they graduated from law school or they joined a year or two later after being in the public defender's office or something, and they stick around. Whereas when you go into these major firms, the people it's not a community. There's different, not all of them are. And it's also very interesting too. I'll just make a couple of sides here. Some of these firms like your Wachtels, your Cravath, your Sullivan and Cromwells, like they don't even really, I make placements. Some of these firms, they don't even really hire laterally because they're enforcing their own culture and they want to create a family. They don't want to give the impact that you can be replaced at any time. And so that it creates a different, and if you stick around, the idea is that you can do well. Wachtell's like that, a great firm. Again, not one of my clients, but this is how it works. So a lot of the firms, this is driven by ego. And it's interesting, those firms. I'd love to write an article about it, but the focus on your ego often will lead to nowhere useful. And if you're centered on how your ego makes them look, you're often going to be in a state where constantly unhappy comparing yourself to others. So again, I apologize for such a long webinar. I wanted to put all this out there. The ego can make you feel loved and appreciated. It often wants to make people better than others and make you feel good about yourself. It also keeps going, often when it's wrong. Far too many attorneys will often stay at the largest firms and work there, even when it's no longer benefiting them when they're wrong. It can make you unhappy. It often also results in a situation where people will stay in environments that are no longer serving them or where they're never going to get ahead because of how they look to others and because they're concerned about how they feel about others. I've seen cases where attorneys are talked to where they're partners or counsel and they're not thought of well in their firms but they're there and they're making a good living and they're around other people that went to these great schools, but they're not respected and they're these second-class citizens, and it's sad. And they stick around because they're concerned that they can't do any better, or they're protecting some vision of themselves that they probably shouldn't be. And your ego determines how you feel about yourself, and it may also be leading you in the wrong direction. And your career and your life, it could take you in a bad direction. And your good sense of self, if you have a good sense of self, it can often help make you tick. The people with the best sense of self, too, by the way, a lot of times have often been athletes. Sometimes they come into law firms having been in, theater or law firm or athlete. They often athletes. It's interesting. And again, I'm not saying I approve of them or don't approve of them, but fraternities and things, I've always had this kind of thing of hazing people and making it very hard to join. And I was under training. I couldn't believe the stuff that happened in the hazing. It was beyond anything these days that people would have gone to prison. But for the stuff that was done to me and others, but it wasn't sexual in nature, but it was not. It involved a lot of bad stuff. But anyway, the point is that those sorts of things, if you don't, being in groups where you're an athlete or all these things can develop your ego and to make you more tolerable to these things. And in contrast, if you don't have that, you can often make it much more difficult and can often make people unhappy. And the problem is a lot of attorneys at one point may have been happy people, and going to the practice of law, like I talked about initially, may be something that has made you unhappy. And maybe your feelings at one point were internal and you felt good about yourself. And then suddenly you got in this law school environment and this law firm environment where you started judging yourself in all these different ways. And that's not good. And most of the greatest religious figures in history, Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad and all these others, their whole conclusion, if you study them, and I've studied them somewhat, but certainly I'm not an expert, but their true happiness, they believe, lies in not having an ego. You can't let your ego control you. I have an interesting thing happen with a lot of people that had worked for me in the past, and people that have worked out and others that haven't. And for years, I would always hire very successful graduates of Harvard Law School that work in big firms to be recruiters and so forth. And these people will often have very big egos and they want to believe they're the best and everything. They don't like many times being told they're not. And the ego is very prevalent in the legal profession. And you have to, in order to be successful, you really need to think about how do you eliminate your ego? How do you drive it down? People have attacked and tried to solve this issue of their ego and the stress and stuff that causes them, and as far almost as human history goes back. And what this means is, how do you do it? You do it through yoga is one way. That's a very popular way that was popularized thousands of years ago in India, I believe. And people do it through therapy, where they go and they talk about their feelings and problems every week or month or whenever you see a therapist. They do it through groups, which are AA or other types of groups when their ego gets out of control. And those have been very successful for people. They do it through religion. People have been going to church and stuff for thousands of years. Some people will exercise, other people will study, but this is what it's all about. I just want to be very clear that you cannot be happy and successful when you follow this like people do. You have to working on ways to do it. Now, some people will close their door in major firms and meditate 20 hours a day, put on some headphones or 20 minutes a day, or they'll learn all these different things. But if you do that, you can be much happier. And again, the reason I think a lot of times people are happier in smaller markets is just because there's not so many huge egos running around, and that can help you be happier. Your objective should be to be happy, content, and really do the best you can in your career. And that's what I want for you. That's what I want for when I work with. And unfortunately, it's easier said than done. But my biggest piece of advice is to figure out methods that you can incorporate into your life to manage your ego, which are the exercise and religion or all these sorts of things, because those things work, and they've worked for thousands of years for people. The other option many times is, if you can't control it, then you go into many times a smaller market. You surround yourself with people where that's not as much as an issue for them. So I'm going to take a quick break for about 5 minutes, and then I will come back. Not even 5 minutes, I'm sorry, like 1 or 2 minutes. And then I will come back and answer any questions you have about this presentation or anything to do with any questions you have about your career. This is a live webinar, so I will answer all questions that you have and do anything I can to help you. So thank you. Okay, ready for questions. One of the things I was going to say too is, if you can either ask questions through the chat, you can ask them. If you ask questions and it puts your name up, I will cut and paste, so I won't show your name if your name's showing up. I don't want sometimes people are very sensitive about that. I will do that. And then the other thing with is you can also raise your hand and I'll call on you and you can talk your question if you like as well. And then or you can talk out loud and I'll be able to hear you and everyone will hear you. So you can do it that way. So you can either raise your hand or ask questions. And if you do ask a question with your name and your name displays, I won't show your name. So these are all confidential questions. So I try to protect people's confidentiality, but sometimes people don't care. So it doesn't. Okay, let me just see here. So I'm trying to find some questions here. And again, ask any questions you like here. So the first question is it possible to determine if law is the right career path for you while you're still in law school? One thing I recommend for all attorneys, if you're in law school, is to really do your best to try to get the best job you can. When you come out of law school, that gives you the best training. So you should look at what happens to people that join different types of employers. So it was interesting when I got out of law school, I did a clerkship, but I was also in a townhouse, which was it wasn't really a townhouse, but it was two kind of apartments, or anyway, it doesn't matter. But I was next to someone that had gone to a local law school, I believe in Lansing, Michigan, and was working for the Social Security Administration and making a lot more money than I was. But then very quickly, they ended up losing their job within a year or 6 months, and I couldn't find anything else. And so you have to ask yourself what happens to people that do the career path you do. So if you do a federal clerkship or a state court clerkship, you'll typically get a job in a law firm or something else, and you'll get training. And so your career path, and if you're in law school and a young attorney, is typically, and your goal needs to be to get the best training you possibly can. And you do not learn how to be a attorney in law school by any stretch of the imagination. You only learn when you start practicing. So you typically want to get into the best environment you can that's going to give you the training. I always recommend a law firm. A clerkship is always good too, but the reason I recommend law firms is it will just give you more options later on. Your options can be to start your own law firm. It can be to go in-house. It can be to work in a bigger law firm, whatever it is, but you're going to get training in the law firm. Law firms will typically train you in two types of law. They'll train you in either consumer-facing law, which is things like personal injury and consumer bankruptcy and all that sort of thing, or they'll train you or trust and estates, or there's a bunch of consumer-facing practice areas, or they will train you in corporate-facing practice areas, which are working for companies and people with a lot of money. So you have to decide which one you want to do. Typically, the best law schools, people will go to work for law firms that represent companies. Then the other law schools that are not the best, you go to work for people that work for law firms that represent individuals. And it's really up to you. No path is better than the other. The only difference is when you go to work in a law firm that represents companies, that gives you options to go to work for companies later. That also gives you to work that probably you get a higher salary. If you go to work for law firms that represent individuals, though, that actually trains you in a business, and you can have a very good career representing individuals in almost any city in the United States. It's funny, every time I go on road trips, I like driving, and I go through all these small towns. There's tons of billboards and things for personal injury attorneys and other people that represent people, and they have good careers. And so you can do all sorts of things with your career. But I definitely recommend everyone getting training to the extent you can in either a consumer-facing law firm or a corporate-facing law firm. Okay, what are the best ways to handle a negative coworker? Okay, so typically when you have very negative coworkers or people that you're working for or with, the best way is typically to just avoid that person. I'm used to deal with people that are often negative, and no matter what you do with negative people, they're never going to be positive. There are people that are just negative, and typically you are going to rise to the level of the people that you're with. You want to do your best to be around people. If you're around negative people, then that's going to rub off on you. I have a kind of a personal philosophy. This may not apply to you, but when I'm dealing with people, there are certain types of people that I deal with that I can't avoid. So I will limit my contact with them. But and I don't know who that would be, but that might be a lawyer, I don't know. But there's certain people that you just can't avoid, so you limit your contact with them. But if there are people that you can limit your contact with, those could be friends, they could be acquaintances, they could be even toxic family members. You probably you're going to be happier if you don't have anything to do with them, unfortunately, because it's just not productive for you to try to engage with those sorts of people. And it's just, unfortunately, that's the way it is. Okay. This is another question. Why are attorneys, despite their prestige, money, and other benefits, still unhappy? Some people are just unhappy. Some people are depressed. Some people have other demons. Some people may be in toxic marriages, toxic relationships, toxic family situations, toxic, who knows? So a lot of people are just that way. It's not just attorneys. It's all sorts of people that will often be unhappy despite all these things. So if you are in that sort of situation and that tempts you, then there's ways around that. You can investigate getting different opinions from doctors and things. But one of the things that I would say is what has been proven to make people happy and to give people happiness. And so this is, I think, is a very important point. And it's community. So community means your family, your friends, your religious groups, all those sorts of things. So when someone has a substance abuse problem and they send them to rehab is nothing more than sending you around a bunch of other people that are, again, there's tons of different rehabs, but essentially what they are is groups of people. And where I live in Malibu, there's tons of these places. I used to live right next door to one, which I couldn't believe. It was a big house with 20 bedrooms. And then all of a sudden the owner decided he was going to rent it out because for tax purposes, I don't even want to sell it or something in the future. So left, and then he rented it out, and then all of a sudden it was a rehab center. But essentially and so I learned a lot about the business by talking to the owners and everything. And so essentially what there is just groups of people coming together with similar problems, and they talk through them. And that's what family is. That's what friends are. That's what religious groups are, is they're communities. And you will get happiness depending on your association with communities. This is really what's been proven to help people. It's what happens when people are having problems is if they put them in a community, they almost always get better. Whether it's going to A meetings or NA meetings or whatever. So this is how problems and happiness is fixed. It's based on community. If you are unhappy, you need to find groups to be around. The problem being an attorney is that, and this is the biggest problem, this is the problem working in law firms and being attorneys, is you are in this environment where, this is why attorneys are unhappy, to answer the question, is you are in this environment where your peers are your enemies many times. They're trying to undermine you, they're trying to get the best of you, where your bosses are often your enemies, where your opposing counsel is your enemy, where the court's your enemy, where all these people, who wouldn't be messed up by that? I mean, think about it. So you have to counterbalance that with something positive and people and groups of people that are positive. The attorneys that have a lot of business and become very successful, like what they do is they literally will spend almost as much time out of the office meeting with people and talking to people and being part of groups as they will spend in the office doing legal work. And that's how they become successful. They don't become successful by sitting in the office and dwelling on all these problems and fighting and work. They make this cut and when I meet attorneys and attorneys with huge books of business, I get a lot of calls and every day and resumes and stuff. But what they do is they will spend just as much time on community and social type pursuits as they will, and making contacts as they will spend just sitting down and working. The people that are sitting down and working are the ones that are unhappiness. And unfortunately, that's what you need to do when you're in a role of your mentor role. But when you get out of that, you can do much. That's what you need to do. You need to either have a very big community of friends and colleagues and a religious group that's supporting you, and you have a routine where you're going and meeting with other people, seeing other people. You need to have a family where you're doing that with. You need to have something, and nothing comes of isolated and surrounded in this very toxic, often scary legal environment. It's the people that isolate themselves that don't have those issues. So I know that there's people watching this and that will talk in the future that are unhappy. And your only solution to get out of this is not getting drunk or prescriptions and maybe, but getting high all the time or getting into all sorts of different sexual or romantic relations. These are not the solutions. They don't come outside of yourself. They come by surrounding yourself with other people. This is what they do when people's lives are out of control and they're having all sorts of problems. They solve them, but they're solved best with community approaches. If you're a drug addict and out of control, or a sex addict and out of control, or a alcoholic and out of control, they get you in there's groups, and those are really the big solution. It's not more of the same by isolating yourself with some prescriptions or something. It's getting around a community, and religions do that for people. And people join religious groups, and the religious groups, they all follow diets or go. These things help. So groups, exercise groups, playing soccer with people every Sunday, all these things are what help. Actors are very good, and even though they have problems too, they have all sorts of groups where they find themselves with others. And so people are really the solution to all these things. And that's why attorneys are unhappy, because they isolate themselves in offices. They work for scraps and bonuses and things they do. This is why they're unhappy. It's that. Okay, so there's good points. Spent years in a toxic, high-profile firm. It was totally abusive relationship. It really impacted me for years. Love the work I do in my solo. Yep, I've seen lots of attorneys that were very unhappy in large law firms become solos. A complete transformation happened where if they were good attorneys and really cared about the work, where they suddenly were happy and they changed their lives. Now, that's to say that would happen with everyone, but it does happen. And I've seen it happen to a lot of people that were completely psychologically demoralized and thought they would never fix it, and then opened their solo practices and became successful. Why is that? And happy. I think it's because suddenly clients were listening to them, clients appreciated them, they had more control over their futures, they knew what was going to happen, all those sorts of things. So I think you have a very good point about how that you became happy being a solo. And again, I think that is something also that can make you very happy as a solo practitioner. Some people do very well with that. They're appreciated, they have control, and all those sorts of things. Okay, let me see here. Okay, this is an interesting question. So, any advice for a former government attorney, which probably means you were a U.S. attorney who's now in Big Law, 13 years of practice. So I think a lot of times former U.S. attorneys do very well. And again, I'm assuming you're a government PD, I don't know, a public defender, I'm sorry. In private practice, I think that the firms often will give you business and all sorts of things if you're doing white-collar criminal related work. My piece of advice would be to avoid toxic people, to try to do as well as you can in the work, and then to balance your career with things related to community, family, friends, and other sorts of things is going to make you probably more successful. That would be my piece of advice to you, and I hope that helps. Okay, what is considered good training? Okay, so good training depends on, let me just fix this here, depends on the individual many times. Good training typically is related to getting feedback on your work, working with people that are working for big clients or the types of clients you want to represent. So if you want to be a personal injury attorney, they may have a robust personal injury practice. If you want to be a corporate attorney, they're working on big matters, and then they're teaching you different things. Training attorneys when they're young and are developing habits. And the best law firms will turn in work that's very well researched, most times, not all of them, very well researched, that is very thorough, anticipates issues that the client would want to avoid, that is very well proved and looks good, that has credibility, that impresses the trier of fact, whether it's a judge or the other side, that all those sorts of things. And then people will train you in that. So what is acceptable in one firm is not acceptable in another. So I'll tell you, I have very funny stories that I could tell from when I was practicing law, but I will tell you that there are law firms out there, big ones, not the most prestigious firms, but lots of law firms that are big and practice and I'm not even talking about insurance defense and things that just don't have the time to put in to do good work, and they will turn in work that is riddled with typos and formatting errors and inappropriate citations to case law and all that sorts of thing. And because of that, that's not good training if that's acceptable. So what is acceptable in one place is not acceptable in others. There's all sorts of, when you talk about athletes, it's interesting. There's all sorts of discussion articles and books about people like Coach Wooden and Pat Riley and all these other sorts of people. And they all have different training standards. Some of them are related to creating teamwork and people, but most of the time when you read and talk about, and people write articles about them and have studied them and write books, it's really that that as coaches, and they set very high standards for the people and they don't just expect things to be done on practice. They make it so when they practice, it's just always going to be a perfect result in whatever they're doing. They're not happy with 80% or even 95. They want 99.5. So that's what good training is. Good training means what leaves the door of a firm, what's acceptable in one place is not going to be acceptable in another. Quality of work and thought that goes into things at the very, very biggest, and are not even the biggest, but the very, very best firms is going to be different than a lot of smaller firms. The way attorneys get people to cooperate and your bosses bring out the best in you as opposed to the worst is going to be different in different firms. So that's what good training is. Since good training is related to the type of people and the type of work how things are, that what's acceptable in one place and not another. How can a former lawyer that left to do other things but wants to return to law as traditional procedures credentials to maximize their chances? Okay, so one of the problems with leaving the practice of law is most law firms will assume that you're going to do it again. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what happens. Almost all the time when lawyers hire people that have left the practice of law and those people come back, they leave very quickly. And if you think about it, you probably will too if you do, if a prestigious law firm hires you. Why is that? I don't know. But whatever was motivating you to leave in the first place nothing is going to change. If you join a prestigious law firm again, you're still going to be upset with the hours, the pressure, all that. But again, the law firm, you have to ask them. And again, I love doing this on every call. So here we go again. But here are the questions the law firms ask when reviewing the resume. And I would say questions smart law firms ask, because they're not all smart law firms. And that's how you get in. Ask when reviewing your resume. So they'll ask, can you do the job? And that is, you probably can. Will you do the job long term? Can you be managed? Managed. Do you want the job? And they'll ask other questions like, can we do better? There's a bunch of questions, but let's just talk about these. So here, you can do the job. So there's no question with your big law credentials and all that sort of stuff that you can definitely do whatever job that they have. So that answer is going to be yes. Will you do the job long term? Almost certainly not. So why is that? Because you haven't stuck with it. You're going to do something. I'm going to tell you, by the way, when I get through all these questions, how you can get into a prestigious firm, because of course you can, but I'm going to tell you what they're asking right now. So they're going to say, will you do the job long term? Anybody that looks at your resume that has any sense of intelligence is going to know that the odds of you sticking with it are poor. Even if you say, I had a bad experience doing something else, or just they know that you're not going to probably do the job long term. Can you be managed? Probably not. So the reason is, being managed means, are you going to sit around and listen to instructions from people that are younger than you and not get mad? And are they going to believe that if you get upset, you're going to leave and all that sort of stuff? And that's exactly what they're going to think. So I don't think you can be managed. Do you want the job? You may want the job. You can possibly go in and convince them that you want the job. And that would be saying, I made a mistake leaving. I did it for this reasons. I had problems with my family, or I was sick, or whatever. And so you may be able to convince them that you want the job, and that's possible. And then, do we like you? They may like you. So this is another thing. So some people are exceptionally good. If they get into an interview, they can be very likable and people will want to hire them. And so they may like you. I don't know the answer to that, but it depends on what you did. But they may. So you may be able to answer that as well. So they may like you, and then you can put down yes. And then, can we do better? Odds are probably yes. And so that means, depending on where the firm is. So if it's a firm in a smaller market, maybe no. But if it's in a big market, then yes, they can definitely do better. They will hire people that have never left the practice of law. So if you are trying to get a job in a big market, which is things like New York, LA, Chicago, Texas, Houston, Austin, you get the idea. Those law firms can definitely hire people that have never left. And as a matter of fact, that's all they hire. They will not hire. It is almost impossible in a big law firm in New York. It happens, of course. So there's exceptions, but it's almost impossible. So how do you get into a more prestigious firm? What you do is you get a job. You do your best to get a job in a smaller market that has big firms in it. And you go to the biggest firm you can in that market doing your practice area, or you go to a firm in a big market that's smaller, and you get the best job you can in that practice area. And you work very hard and do a good job and show a lot of potential, and then you move back in to a big firm. But you're going to need to show, no big firm is going to take the risk of hiring someone if you don't look like you're going to stick around. They just won't. You wouldn't either. Think about your background. You wouldn't take that risk if you were hiring someone like that. So that is what I would recommend. Okay, let me just see here. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have. I certainly appreciate everyone being on this call. I hope everyone has a good break and a holiday. And we'll, of course, be back next week. And I'm not sure what the topic is, but we'll be back next week. And I very much appreciate everyone being here today. And I hope everyone has a great holiday and this advice was helpful. We do, of course, this is recorded. We will send this when this comes out. It'll be on our website, hopefully in the next week or two. And if there were any parts that you missed, you can watch it again. So thanks again. And I hope you have a good holiday. Bye.